Hello and welcome to another episode of Q&A. Today we're joined by Allyn Crowe, Principal Engineer at Nexum. Been working in the wireless space for 30 years, Allyn. Give the audience a little bit about your background. How'd you get into the wireless business?
Sure. So I started out, I did a couple summer internships with the Air Force at their communications countermeasures lab. So we were doing wireless before it was Wi-Fi. So all kinds of RF work, that kind of thing. I proceeded in and started my first year at university doing networking in the residence halls, and then since then have just moved through things. So now I design and architect networks, both wireless and wired, all over the place.
So I think you and I have a lot in common because I started my wireless career in the 80s. Before there was Wi-Fi, it was all, even unlicensed spectrum had just come out.
Sure.
And I've got a whole bookshelf of books. When I was learning wireless, I've got a bookshelf of every book I could buy on wireless nowadays.
Oh, yeah.
When you think of the next generation of engineers coming up, any words of wisdom on how should they get started with networking?
Sure.
It definitely is not like you and I did it.
Yeah, no. Back when, at least when I started, networking was really cool. That was the big thing that was happening. We were, wiring things. Now, focus has shifted, but there's still a lot of really good things you can do long term in networking. It can be a springboard to other areas too. And you're right. I started with the books, all the big manuals that walk through everything. I think now people that I see are doing a lot more with video, both short form and long form. I don't hear of too many people picking up networking books and walking through TCP dumps and all the rest of it until they're farther on in their career. So I think definitely understanding how learning has changed in the industry, both for newer people and for those of us who've been doing it and still have to learn on occasion. It's good.
No, it seems like even my kids, going to college and everything now, the whole learning process, the way you learn, you've got so many more tools available to you with YouTube, videos, now we have ChatGPT.
Sure.
How has this affected? Are you a big ChatGPT fan? Are you actually using that in your job nowadays?
I do in my job on occasion. I use it a lot of times to summarize for me.
Okay.
What I've noticed with a lot of the younger folks that I work with, both in mentoring and then newer in their career, is they've replaced Google and or other search engines with the LLM of their choice. Sometimes it's ChatGPT, sometimes it's Claude or Gemini. And it's really interesting to notice that shift because there was a long-running joke when I started networking that if you didn't know it, Google always did. And so we would go out, we would search, we'd go through articles, we'd go through knowledge base articles, all kinds of things, and then get the answer and kind of try things out as we went. Now I've known, quite a few. My kids like to hop on there and ask it a question, and then they just take what that says as gospel sometimes. And so what I've had to do, especially with my kids, is train them that, hey, that LLM response may not be true in some ways. So you really have to understand what it's saying, how it's saying it, and then put it to the test. Is it actually true? Do some deep research. Find out if you're writing code, is the code that it's giving you going to work?
Yeah. Now, when you and I started, you look about the same, maybe a little younger, but I think we all started with CLIs.
Oh yeah.
I know you're a misfit.
Oh yeah.
I don't think there's a CLI on that access point nowadays, right?
Not the access points, nope.
No. Now, recommendations for the next generation networking?
Sure.
Is it important to know all those CLI commands we used to always remember?
I really think it's going to depend on what area you're in. So in the wireless world, no. I think the tools that we have available to us in graphical form have far surpassed what we could get to in a CLI. I would say in the switching and the routing world, where I still spend a good portion of my time, the CLI is still there. And what we see is if you don't know that CLI and you're only relying on the graphical tools, then you're going to be at a bit of a disadvantage, especially when it comes to troubleshooting. As we know, troubleshooting is time dependent. So it's easy, and the way I do troubleshooting these days is I still go to the CLI, and then I bring it up into the tools and find out and aggregate. So if I'm looking at point things, CLI is the way to start. If I'm looking at big pieces of information, so I'm trying to find a problem that's been long running, or it's our favorite one that we love in network, it's intermittent, then an LLM or some kind of graphical tool, especially one that has that domain knowledge, can be a huge help.
Now, I'm personally curious because, like you, I started my career in wireless.
Okay.
And I did wireless because I always loved physics. There's always there's always a right answer.
Sure.
As opposed
Absolutely.
to routing protocols, it's like, we argue about these bits and bytes and everything.
Oh yeah.
For you, wireless, you got to wireless of all the networking pieces, networking, wireless, cybersecurity. What made you choose wireless?
Sure. These days I do a little bit of all of it. So I work for a cybersecurity reseller and professional services organization. So I still have that in what I have to do. I also think that security needs to be a part of everyone's job when it comes to the architecture and the deployment. Wireless, though, is still, I love it. I've been doing it longer. It goes beyond Wi-Fi. There's so many different ways you can work with it. And, when we talk switching, when we talk routing, that's a certain group and a certain approach to things that I think wireless, we get a little bit more art in what we get to do. RF propagation and refraction and all the rest of it, there's a bit more of an art to it than when you plug a cable in on two ends. The bits are going to go where you tell them to go.
Do you think the next generation of wireless engineers really need to understand path laws and all the physics around wireless, or do you think that's unnecessary nowadays?
I think there's an advantage to that, right? So as we're doing design, understanding how RF works in the world, in the real world, so to speak, there's some advantage to that. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be up front. When you're going through your career, boiling the ocean, so to speak, we don't have to do all that up front. I think you can push that off a little bit more now. Whereas, we've moved beyond the red solo cup circles for wireless design. We've got tools now that can do a lot of that and make all of that physics a lot easier and more approachable.
Yeah, but we both know Sadir, right?
Oh yeah.
What does Sadir always tell us about the two problems?
Yep.
It's either I can't connect or Wi-Fi
sucks.
or
Yep.
Wi-Fi slow. That tends to always get down to other parts of the network.
Oh yeah.
Do you feel like the engineers of the future need to understand client, LAN, WAN?
Oh yeah.
How broad do you really have to be if you're solving, client application problems, right?
Sure.
Because it may be wireless, but there may be something else going on.
Sure. I think in networking, the fundamentals are still critical. I don't think that the fundamentals of networking have changed for at least 25 of my 30 years. Let's go with that. I think that things like how to what happens when I go to my web browser and type in www.insertnamehere.com and I hit enter. What happens? What are the protocols that are involved? How do they work? At least at a high level, because that's what helps me define where the problems lie. And so some of the tools are really good at pointing out, hey, this isn't my fault. We talk about mean time to innocence versus mean time to failure in wireless, right? But being able to really understand how all these things are interrelated is still critical.
Yeah, but how many network engineers does it take to screw in a light bulb type of thing, right? It's like,
Sure.
I've got a slow Zoom Teams problem.
Yeah.
You're the wireless expert.
Sure.
Do you have to call in the routing expert, the WAN expert? To get to the bottom of a networking problem, they're getting so complicated now.
Yeah.
Can one engineer actually troubleshoot it down to the problem? Or how often do you have to ask your friends for help?
Sure. I think what we're seeing, at least what I'm seeing with a lot of my clients, is there's less and less people to do the same amount of work. And so that person on the networking side, sometimes you see it differentiated where it's, hey, you're the wireless person. The wireless always gets blamed, right? So I've got to be able to figure out what, if it is my problem, and if it's not, whose problem is it? Is it, we always know it's DNS, right? So we've got to figure out how is it DNS? Is it the firewall that's blocking DNS? Something along those lines. So we have to have the capability to understand what we're seeing and then figure out who do I need to call to get this fixed, whether it's the server team for DNS, whether it's the firewall team or the security team for the firewall blocks, those kind of things. Those are still happening day to day. And so it's no longer good enough to just say, hey, my tool says the wireless is doing great. You've got full signal, all of that's fine. We've got to be able to say, well, it's not the wireless specifically, but here's where the problem may lie and here's how we fixed it.
Okay, well, I've got to ask you, I ask all my guests this now. It's like
Sure.
client, cloud, client, wireless, LAN, firewall, WAN, application.
Sure.
What percentage of the time, how do you break it down in your experience and looking
Sure.
at all the different problems you saw? How often is the client, how often is a wireless problem?
It's a really low percentage. Usually a new network or an upgrade, something like that, we may see some wireless issues, but then it really comes down to, okay, what else has changed? We put in a new wireless network, so we were upgrading. Well, at the same time, we re-IP'd the entire network. Well, the firewall team didn't get that memo and forgot to unblock networks. Or the application team didn't allow for that. Those kind of things. So we still have that, but I think the big thing is, as I kind of saw in the networking, the hardware or the hardwire networking world, once that became kind of utilitarian,
So who's the
it
problem?
was that problem.
Who's the problem child to my poor Zoom experience? You're saying the wireless guy is not to blame,
I always
we're
blame
talking
the application guys.
The application. You think the application? Do you think
Oh,
they're
yeah.
doing 50% of the time? Who's the big?
50% of the
long
time,
pole here.
it's the applications.
The application.
Oh, yeah.
Oh my God.
Yep.
Geez, throwing them under the bus. That's pretty
You
bad.
know,
All right.
it's always a fun question to ask. I've worked on development teams, and it's okay. You want this to work on the network, but what ports are you using? What does your communication look like between you and the client? And I would say a good 7 out of 10 times the answer is the what?
Oh,
So-
they misconfigured it.
Or they just don't know. They know that they put in, they communicate. Maybe they'll know that they communicate on TCP 443 because it's HTTPS. But I had application teams that didn't know that. So a lot of times when it was a new application, we had to just capture all the traffic and then sort it out for ourselves.
Now, I think, when I look at networking through our careers and everything, I think we went through this kind of CLI phase. Then we got into this cloud dashboard, API, Python. I think, IT became much more of a Python programming, automating things.
Oh, yeah.
Now we're in this agentic world.
Yeah.
Your personal experience, I assume you're a Python programmer. You write your own little Python automation scripts and everything.
I have, for my entire career, called myself a really good code hacker of other people's code. I have a computer science degree, so my college degree was in programming. I learned programming, everything from Fortran through Java, and it never interested me. Probably why I blame the application guys too.
Yeah.
But what I noticed was, yes, it started to become more and more important that, even when I started and we were doing CLI, what was the first thing we did when we had a big project, right? We opened a new notepad window and we copy and pasted the commands that we were going to run, and then we pasted them into the CLI, right? Original scripting. And I think, as that progressed, APIs became important. APIs became, supported not just, after the fact, but at the beginning. And Python, got real big at that. I started writing some Python there. And then now I've started moving into the agentic world and trying to get my hands and head around some of how all these things interact. So I've started using LLMs to help me code because I am not a coder. And so, using things like Visual Studio Code or one of the others to help me, hey, how do I do this? And it gives me information, and then I can start going from there.
Any MCP stuff in your world yet?
Oh yeah, well, I've been a Mist fan and using Mist since early 2019. So, what has come from the MCP side of the house and the Mist thing is critical. I have a lot of clients in different areas of commerce and different verticals, those kind of things, and so what the MCP servers have allowed us to start doing is I can now write scripts that not just talk to my networking equipment, but can interrogate other pieces and parts. Yeah. We've moved beyond source of truth being a text file to an Excel spreadsheet to now we've got databases and everything else specifically designed to do that.
Yeah, so for the next generation of, network engineers, I'd be interested to get your perspective on, you kind of went through this Python automation thing where our customers really built a lot of automation on top of our APIs.
Yeah.
Now we're moving into this MCP world where they're putting MCP servers, like you say, on top of all their vendors and sources. It seems to become this orchestration layer.
Yep.
How do you see automation changing? Is it really changing that much? Or are we just changing the plumbing to get to the APIs now?
In a lot of ways, we're changing the plumbing. It's still, a lot of the MCP servers still interact directly with the APIs that we're used to directing, right? But what this has allowed us to do, and where security comes into my world, is now I've got that a little bit of a buffer there between how I get to that API, who's available to get to that API. From a security perspective, we always want to limit that. We see CVEs every month around exposing a management or an admin interface to people that shouldn't have access to it, causing problems. And APIs are that, right? They're a management interface in a lot of ways. So MCPs really allowed us to get a little bit of abstraction there and then broaden our horizons.
Now, you're at Nexum, you do a lot of networking.
Yep.
You find it hard to hire networking talent, or is network engineering still a hot place to be? Or do you think it's getting harder and harder to find good networking engineers?
I think it's getting interesting to find people who have done just networking. We see a lot more. I get a lot more folks, especially working for a security company, that they want to jump right into cybersecurity because that's super fancy. We see a lot of marketing around all the jobs that are available, and you can start with 6-figure salaries and all those kind of things. And what a lot of the students that I work with who are just starting their careers, they want to jump right to that because money is king. And I really have to talk them into, hey, you have to start with something that allows you to build on to get to cybersecurity. It's not necessarily, for most people, it's not an entry-level career. So what that's done is now we get people that come in and say, well, I've got a cybersecurity degree, and it's like, okay, but what networking do you know? And they say, well, I had this or this, a couple classes. Or we get people that have been doing networking for 10, 15 years before cybersecurity started getting as big. So that entry-level networking-only person is getting a little bit more of a challenge to find.
Okay. Now, as we said, you're a misfit.
Yeah.
We've been on this self-driving networking journey for since we started the mission in 2014. Worried about self-driving networks, eliminating the need for IT, or where do you think we are on the journey to self-driving networks?
Sure.
And how do you see it affecting the next generation of networking engineers?
Yeah, I think we talked about it a couple of years ago, and I've been on board for it. I think, there's a lot of pieces of networking that we automate anyway. So allowing that network, there's a big push for human in the loop, which I think makes sense in most cases. But things like, hey, this port is stuck, or hey, there's these things that we know that are low issues that we know the first thing we're going to do is if a port's stuck, we're going to bounce the port. Let it do it. I think I said when we talked, I said, I'm ready. I'm ready for it to start taking care of all these things so I can stop getting phone calls at 3 a.m.
Well, it's interesting because you've already been in the wireless space so far. We've been twisting major resource management has been adjusting wireless knobs for 20-some years. That was probably the first generation of self-driving, right? We all trust our RRM now.
Yeah.
But it seems like we're at the next phase of configuration.
Yeah.
Stuck ports, missing VLANs.
Oh, yeah.
Those are very sensitive topics to most IT people to let someone start playing around with their knobs.
Sure.
Missing VLANs, where are you going to trust, where do you think you're going to trust this AI assistant to do something?
Sure.
What's your best example of a self-driving use case that you now trust your AI doing?
I think it's funny because I've seen people especially on the wired side, say, well, I'm not going to trust AI to add that VLAN when it knows it's not there. But at the other side, then they use dynamic configuration profiles, right? So we have that ability to, based on a MAC address, reconfigure that entire port. Well, a MAC address is relatively easy to spoof these days. Yeah. So now they're doing things with what they consider base automation that the AI is actually going to have more capabilities around it because it's going to look at that and go, hey, the reason I see this and the reason I can do this is because I know that this should be there and it's not.
Yeah, I mean, my analogy has always been the Waymo self-driving taxi. At some point you get, convince yourself that it's actually safer than a human driver.
Yeah.
If you look at Waymo as kind of the one metric of a self-driving thing, where do you see networking? How far on the journey are we? Are we 10%, 20% on the way to the Waymo experience for networking?
I think it's funny because we've been doing this a while, right? And how many times have we seen a new technology come out that everybody's like, no, we can't do that. We can't. I've got to say, we saw it with GUIs. We saw it with cloud platforms. I think that, self-driving network, where the network is taking care of itself, is that next advance that people are pushing back against. How far are we? I'd say it's going to depend on what platform is being used and who the networking people are. If they're people who are more willing to take, let the network do some of those things. I'm seeing some clients that they're running 40, 50%. The first thing they did when, Marvis Actions were released and good, they're turning them on as fast as they can. And then I've got others that are like, we don't even, we don't trust that, So I think there's a lot of it depends in there, unfortunately, still.
Okay, well, any final words for this next generation of networking engineers?
Sure.
Python, Agentic AI, which of the next generation of networking engineers really focus on? Recommendations, security, TCP?
Start with your basics.
Okay.
The basics are still there, and they will carry you through your entire career. Then start playing with things that are fun. Get your lab going. Have some fun in the lab. Get to a point where you understand those things. Don't just let AI write code for you, but understand what it's writing and why it's important that you do it in certain ways. I think that's curiosity grounded in fundamentals has been how I've done my entire career. So I think it's held me pretty well. So hopefully it holds new people.
Now, Allyn, I want to thank you for coming. Wireless is a topic dear to my heart, as you know, so it's been an honor to have you here with me.
Sure.
It's always fun talking about wireless. I want to thank the Q&A audience for joining us today and look forward to you on the next episode of Q&A.